Good afternoon. Welcome to the Sherlock Hibbs Symposium on Austrian Economics for 2025. My name is Balaji Rajagopalan. I'm honored to serve as the Dean of the Trulaske College of Business, a nationally ranked college with many years of outstanding success of our students. Most recently, we were ranked at number 40 among the public business schools in the country, and the entire community is proud of the college. We assemble here today for a signature event, the Sherlock Hibbs Symposium on Austrian Economics. And every year, we invite outstanding scholars to present on a topic of their expertise. And today, we are delighted and honored to be joined by Dr. Bruce Caldwell, a research professor of economics and the director of the Center for the History of Political Economy at Duke University. Dr. Caldwell is a leading expert in the life and contributions of the 20th century economist and social theorist Friedrich A. Hayek. Today's distinguished guest has spent the past 3 decades studying the Nobel-winning works of Hayek. Dr. Caldwell is the author of Hayek's Challenge, an intellectual biography of F.A. Hayek, the general editor of the collected works of F.A. Hayek, and the editor of MPS 1947, transcripts of the founding meeting of the Mont Pelerin Society. He is also currently writing a family authorized biography of Hayek, which is titled Hayek, A Life. Please join me giving Dr. Bruce Caldwell a warm welcome, who will be introducing us to the life and ideas of F.A. Hayek. Before I turn the podium over to Dr. Bruce Caldwell, just a quick note on questions. If you would want to put the questions that you have for Dr. Caldwell at any time during his presentation, but he will respond to them after he concludes his talk. Thank you for your understanding. Dr. Caldwell, the floor is yours.
Dr. Caldwell, I'm going to need you to unmute.
Dr. Caldwell, you're muted.
Okay, can everyone hear me now? Sorry for the false start. I'm delighted to be here, albeit by Zoom rather than in person. And I am going to be talking about Hayek, his life and ideas. And I provided, or I hope you've gotten, a handout that has on one side some references to his life, on the other side some of his major contributions. So I'll be referring to that as I go through my talk today, and hopefully you'll be able to follow along. So, as you can see from Hayek, a chronology, the first handout, he was born in Vienna in 1899, and he lived until 1992. So his was a 20th century life. And he's a Nobel Prize winning economist and social theorist. So he's interacted with lots of different people. And what I'm going to try to establish in talking about his life for the first 10 or 15 minutes, just how many different people he interacted with. Hayek was one of these zealot type figures who was involved with all of the major figures in 20th century economics, to be sure. So he knew everyone. He was at the right place at the right time. We're also going to see that he was at specific moments in time at the right place. But from most people's points of view, he was there with the wrong ideas. He was constantly engaging with people saying, no, I respectfully disagree. No, that's not the way I see it. And he did this in a very mild-mannered way, but a very persistent way. And it's wonderful to see in terms of the development of his ideas, how many of his ideas were indeed formulated in opposition to ideas that were then popular, then the latest thing. So that's what I'm going to try to establish in the first 15 minutes or so of the talk. And then we'll take a look at what those actual ideas were. So we'll look at the second sheet of paper, and I'll give you a general overview and then go into some detail into some of those ideas. So that's how we'll proceed. So as I said, born in 1899 in Vienna, fin de siècle Vienna. This was a period of great intellectual, political, cultural, artistic creativity, but also ferment. Great artists like Klimt and Kokoschka. We had Sigmund Freud in psychology, setting up people on his couch to psychoanalyze them. Zionism was really born in Vienna at this time with Theodor Herzl. So there was a number of different things. And of course, the Austrian School of Economics is the one that would be most interested in as something that had been created in the 1870s and was well underway by the time he was born. So Hayek, as a child, was he was in the upper middle class. He's a von Hayek. Saw war service on the Italian front, and then went to university after the war service. When he was at the university, he studied under Friedrich von Wieser, and then he also had a time with a group called the Geistkreis. The Geistkreis was a typically Viennese affair. You think of Vienna coffee houses where people gathered to sit and talk about ideas. The Geistkreis was a similar sort of affair. So he and a number of his classmates at the university would get together every couple of weeks in someone's home, and one of the members' home, and they would present a paper, and the other members would discuss it. And often it would be on topics that were not topics of the person was studying at university. Some of the people that he met in this little group, I mentioned there three who might be known to people who have studied economics: Fritz Machlup, Gottfried Haberler, and Oscar Morgenstern. Morgenstern, if you've studied actually anything in the social sciences, he with John von Neumann was the developer of game theory. So this was a classmate of Hayek's who went on to develop one of the tools that is used not only in the social sciences. One of the times that I encountered it as well was when I sat in on a dissertation in a psychology department, and they were talking about optimal foraging behavior and sorts of decisions that had to be made by animals. So he finishes his second degree. They take 2 degrees in German language university systems, and goes for 15 months to the United States. He spent most of his time there in New York, and particularly New York City. He was studying at NYU, but he also was taking courses up at Columbia University, where Wesley Clair Mitchell was a professor. Wesley Clair Mitchell is one of the founders of American institutionalism, one of the movements in economics that was developing at the time. So he was encountering really one of the leading members. Soon after Hayek left New York, Mitchell became president of the American Economic Association, gave a presidential address. So he's interacting with some prominent economists in the United States. He goes back to Vienna, and he joins another circle. Kreis is German for circle. This is the Mises Kreis. So he's studying with Ludwig von Mises and others in a circle, again, that meets on a regular basis during term to discuss issues in methodology in particular were being discussed at that time with Mises and others in that circle. Then in 1931, a big event happened. He got an invitation to present some lectures at the London School of Economics. The invitation came from Lord Beveridge, okay, William Beveridge, who was the director of the school. This is the same Beveridge who would go on to write the Beveridge Report, which was published at the end of World War II, that basically provided the foundation or framework for the British welfare state that would follow later. The London School of Economics had been established in 1895 by Fabian socialists, but they were eager to get the best people that they could find to teach there. And Lionel Robbins, who was in the economics department at LSE, had read a paper by Hayek in German. He liked it very much and asked Beveridge to invite Hayek. So Hayek came and gave 4 lectures that later published as Prices in Production. And on the basis of these lectures, they invited him to become first a visiting professor, and then the next year they offered him a named chair, the Took chair. And he remained at LSE until 1950, when he went to the University of Chicago. So he arrives at the LSE and immediately becomes engaged in a variety of debates, the most famous of which is with John Maynard Keynes. Keynes had published a book in 1930 called A Treatise on Money. Hayek reviewed this book. He wrote a 2-part review, the first part of which appears in the summer issue, summer of 1931, in Economica, which is the house journal for the London School of Economics. And in it, he criticizes Keynes's views in A Treatise on Money. Now, who was Keynes at this time? At this time, he was not the world's famous John Maynard Keynes, who had published the general theory. That wouldn't happen until 1936. But he was a very prominent British economist. He was at King's College up at Cambridge. So Cambridge was kind of the home of economics in the United Kingdom, in England. Alfred Marshall had been at Cambridge, and his textbook was the Principles of Economics, was the leading textbook really in the English language. So Keynes was a prominent economist at a prominent university, and here's this much younger upstart foreigner really criticizing his book. So Keynes and Keynes's biographer, Donald Mogridge, pointed out in his biography that Keynes was apoplectic when he had read Hayek's review. He just couldn't believe that this person was attacking him in this way. Keynes's copy of Hayek's review was the most marked up piece of paper in the Keynes archives, according to his biographer. So Keynes wanted to offer a response, and he did so by doing his own review. And this is a review of Hayek's Prices in Production, which had just come out. Well, he didn't really write a review. What he did was he asked for a chance to reply to Hayek's attack or critical review of his own book. But in responding to Hayek, first couple of pages, he's responding to Hayek's criticisms, saying, okay, I see this point, but this point is not quite right. But then he goes on to say, I made some mistakes, sure, but it's nothing compared to the errors that this Prices in Production is filled with. So in his response to Hayek's review, he kind of offers his own review of Hayek's Prices in Production. I'm going to just read just one little snippet of his response to give you a sense of the flavor. This is in talking about Hayek's Prices in Production. Keynes says, "The book as it stands seems to me to be one of the most frightful muddles I have ever read. An extraordinary example of how, starting with a mistake, a remorseless logician can end up in Bedlam," Bedlam being the mental hospital. Now you get a sense there not only of Keynes's biting sarcasm, but also his command of the English language. I mean, Hayek was writing in his book had to be edited for style by Lionel Robbins. He was no competitor in terms of his rhetorical abilities, and he's going up against, right at the beginning, with somebody who has this obvious skill, John Maynard Keynes. And this debate between the two men really established Hayek's name in England when he arrived there, because even though the general theory was not to be until 6 years later, 5 years later, the debate got everyone's attention. You didn't see this sort of exchange taking place in academic journals, perhaps not even today, but certainly not at the time. Okay, so let's just move on. So he was engaged in lots of different debates over this time, and we'll take a look at their different theories when we get to the substantive part of looking at their intellectual contributions. But he takes this position at LSE, and he's there all through the 1930s. And then, and probably the most important aspect of his time there is something called the Grand Seminar. Lionel Robbins ran this seminar. Hayek co-ran it for the first few years anyway, and also Arnold Plant. And there was a great number of people who would later become very important economists who were passing through as junior faculty members or as students. And it was in this environment that a lot of what an economist today would recognize as the diagrams that are used in intermediate price theory, intermediate microeconomics, were developed. So Hayek was right on the ground when all of these ideas that would later stabilize as the corpus of economic learning in microeconomics were being taken from a verbal exposition to a mathematical exposition or graphical exposition. So he was in place there in what George Shackle, who was one of the many people who attended these things during the years of high theory, when these ideas were formalized in a way that they could be expressed mathematically. By the end of the 1930s, World War II begins. The first year is kind of a mild. It was called the Phony War. Not much was happening. But then when the Low Countries and France were invaded, it suddenly heated up quite dramatically. And the Blitz started to occur, the bombing of London. And the London School of Economics was evacuated up to Cambridge. It's interesting, given the initial encounter between Keynes and Hayek, how close their relationship became in these later years. Keynes, in fact, ended up inviting Hayek to become a member of the high table at King's College and helped give him rooms in King's College for a time until Hayek and his family were able to settle into a house that they could all live in. So they became quite close. And indeed, Keynes would later have some very glowing words to say about the road to serfdom. I'll come back to that in a bit. It was because of World War II starting that Hayek kind of moved away a little bit from economics and started to take up a project that he later would call the Abuse of Reason Project. This was going to be a massive 2-volume work where he would show in the first volume how a certain set of ideas developed in the 19th century, and they spread from country to country, and these ideas gave birth to the totalitarian ideas, or made possible the rising of totalitarian regimes in various countries in Europe. Out of this work came The Road to Serfdom. At war's end, by the way, another person that he encountered in the 1930s, just as a person giving a paper at a seminar, was Karl Popper, the famous philosopher of science. And he and Hayek started up a correspondence during the war. Popper was isolated down in New Zealand. They had a very active correspondence. On the basis of this, Hayek helped Popper publish The Open Society and Its Enemies, a fundamental book, Cold War book. It was later interpreted as that was a critique of various types of reasoning and thinking, and also helped, as a result of this, to bring him to the London School of Economics, where for a while they were together teaching. The Road to Serfdom was published in 1944, and it would have been a book of some interest, but what really gave it legs was that a Reader's Digest condensation was published of it. And this brought it to the attention of literally almost 10 million people through the Reader's Digest and also Book of the Month Club. picked up the supplement. So a condensation means he wrote the Road to Serfdom, and then there was a 20-page version that most people got to learn about his ideas that was put out by the Reader's Digest. And this led to a lot of speaking tours internationally. And he later recounted that he would go to every country, and everywhere he went, he'd find one or two people who were sympathetic to the views that he expressed in The Road to Serfdom. That is to say, a criticism of socialism and to call for a return to classical liberalism. And he, on the basis of these interactions that he had in these various places that he gave talks, he established a society. He didn't establish it. He called for a meeting in 1947 that took place in Switzerland on the banks in a place called Mont Pelerin, leading down to Lake Geneva, a nice resort area. And it was a gathering of all of the people who were liberals, who were many of them in economics, but not only, in Western Europe and the United States. And this, again, part of the theme here is how he's interacting with people who are famous 20th century economists. The list of people who came to this initial 1947 meeting is absolutely stunning. From the University of Chicago and from the States, Frank Knight, Milton Friedman's brother-in-law, Aaron Director, George Stigler, who was then at Columbia University, but later would join them at the University of Chicago. That's just some of the American representatives. Some people that he knew from Vienna, like Mises and Machlup, attended this first meeting. Lionel Robbins and other prominent British liberals attended. In Germany, liberalism is often associated with the term ordoliberalism. Walter Eucken and Wilhelm Röpke attended it. Karl Popper attended this first meeting, as did Michael Polanyi, not Karl, but Michael Polanyi, another a liberal thinker. So he was bringing together. He was someone who was a great networker, but also someone who was creating networks by bringing these people together at Mont Pelerin in 1947. The Mont Pelerin Society exists to this day. I've attended a few of its meetings, and it's a robust society of liberals who get together to be able to discuss ideas without having to explain themselves to people, because often liberal ideas, particularly in 1947, were not ideas that people gave much credit to. He moves in 1950, and his major reason for the move was he wanted to get a divorce and marry someone that he had known since childhood. His first marriage produced 2 children, and his first wife was a wonderful person, but he was still in love with a person from his youth that, through various reasons, he didn't marry. So got a divorce, married his third cousin, and moved to the University of Chicago, where he was on the Committee on Social Thought, which is a very interesting organization or committee, very typical of Chicago. They formed a lot of different sorts of committees at Chicago during this period, but this was interdisciplinary at the graduate level. So it brought together instructors from a variety of different fields and brought in students who would benefit from an interdisciplinary sort of approach. The committee is also still alive and well at the University of Chicago. It was here that he published his book on psychology called The Sensory Order, and also The Constitution of Liberty. He moved in 1962 to the University of Freiburg, which was then in what we'd call Western Germany, when there was West and East Germany. He then spent a little time in Salzburg. It was in Salzburg that he received the Nobel Prize. And he received it jointly with a socialist, Swedish socialist, Gunnar Myrdal. Neither person was particularly happy with the pairing. This led to a certain amount of tension, but they had known each other and not really appreciated each other's works. There's a long-standing kind of animosity between the two since the 1930s. Indeed, Hayek was responsible for getting some of Myrdal's works that were first published in German to be published in English. Okay, so moving on, he returns to Freiburg at the very end of his life. His final book, The Fatal Conceit, is a little bit problematical because it was put together by Bill Bartley, who was the first general editor of the Hayek collected works. And finally, he dies in Freiburg in 1992. So it is very much a 20th century life. He was in the United States when Wesley Clare Mitchell, the leading institutionalist, was hitting his stride. He goes to England when Keynes is hitting his stride, and the Keynesian revolution is not to happen for another 10 or 15 years, but just at its start. He is in the University of Chicago when the Chicago School of Economics is in fact forming. So he's at these places where great sets of ideas or great visions of how economics should be and what sorts of theories should be were to be embraced were being developed. So he's actually a great person for studying the development of economics in the 20th century, simply because he was there at the time, and also because he often had different views. So now I'd ask people to, if they have that sheet of paper with them, to turn to the second side and take a look at Hayek's contributions. And the first thing I'll do is to ask you just simply to scan the entire page, because what you can see, there are a number of headings. Model of a capital using monetary economy. So this is a theoretical model that incorporates both money and capital. His works on socialism and knowledge. There's a buzz phrase that if you've heard about Hayek, you'll say, oh, the road to serfdom would be one thing you'd say, the other would be the knowledge problem. So show how the ideas about knowledge and socialism go together. That's something else I'll try to do. The Abuse of Reason Project, which was already mentioned, is wartime effort that led to the publication of The Road to Serfdom. His later works in political philosophy, Constitution of Liberty and Law, Legislation and Liberty. And finally, some of his works on spontaneous orders and complex phenomena, which are essential to understanding his views. So I'd like to talk a little bit about each of these, and then I'll end my presentation, and we'll have some time for questions. So if we think about model of a capital using monetary economy, he's developing a theoretical model. But his particular approach is going to be dominated by the sort of experiences that he had, and we're going to contrast him with John Maynard Keynes, who had very different experiences. So Hayek lived in Vienna. After World War I, the Austrian state experienced hyperinflation. It was not of the type that they experienced, but not quite as severe as what had been experienced in Germany, but still quite a devastating hyperinflation. And what a hyperinflation does is it destroys your savings. So all of these good Austrian citizens who had supported their war effort, the war that they lost, had put their money into war bonds, okay, had bought bonds, devoted their life savings or a substantial part of their savings to supporting the war effort. And then during that hyperinflation, what ends up happening is money loses its value dramatically. So when they got their money back from their bonds, they were being returned pennies on their hundreds or thousand crown investments. So it basically reduces the wealth of the middle class, who are the people who were buying those bonds. And this is the sort of thing that sets up the possibility for people like Hitler in Germany, although he was from Austria, Hitler in Germany, to come in and say, look, yeah, we're not going to take it anymore. Follow me. So he saw the ill effects of hyperinflation. In the same way, we should note that Keynes was dealing throughout the 1920s with the British problem. It was not inflation, it was unemployment. Unemployment, Keynes wrote in the mid-1920s, is stuck in a rut. It was stuck around 10% throughout the 1920s and then only worsened during the Great Depression. If you think about Keynesian remedies, these are remedies that are aimed at trying to attack particularly unemployment. This is something that he developed during the Great Depression when that was the main problem. So those are things to keep in your mind in the background when thinking about these models that are being developed by these two brilliant thinkers. I mentioned that Hayek studied with Wesley Clare Mitchell when he was in the United States. Mitchell was someone whose name was associated with stabilizing the price level. The Federal Reserve System had been set up only about 10 years earlier, and he was talking about how it might be used to avoid business cycles And what they came up with was the idea of saying, well, we stabilize a price level. This seemed alien to Hayek. If those of you who have studied economics, doing this talk here at the business school, you'll know that when you in your microeconomics classes, everything is done by relative prices. You don't deal with aggregates and averages. And so it was alien to him. And he said, this doesn't seem to be the right way to approach things. So anyway, he was developing a business cycle theory. It drew on the work of Wicksell and on Mises. And I won't go into the details, but I'll just give you a flavor of it. It really is a theory that looks at the role of the interest rate and viewed it as a price that basically coordinates intertemporal production and consumption decisions. And to see this, what I want you to do, and I'm just going to ask you to imagine a demand and supply diagram, because I'm in a business school. I think at least some of you will be able to do this, but even if you haven't had this kind of background, you'll get the general idea. If you think about the market for loanable funds, you've got a demand curve, right? Downward sloping demand curve. People demand more loanable funds at lower interest rates. So this is firms who would be borrowing for capital projects, okay? Capital investment projects, creating capital goods or purchase of capital goods. And at lower interest rates, more of these projects become viable, so they demand more capital goods. The supply of loanable funds is basically household savings. That's who supplies. If you've got excess money, you put it in the bank. Banks loan out those funds, so that's the supply. That's what the supply curve comes from. And the intersection of the supply and demand is the equilibrium interest rate. So just imagine a society where people undertake more savings, where there's an increase in savings, where the savings curve supply curve shifts out. Why would people save more? Typically, people save more because they want more or something in the future. They might be saving up to purchase a home or a car for their child's education. So whatever thing that is in the future that they want to purchase more of, their savings now. Okay, so households want more stuff in the future. They save. This increases the supply of savings. It lowers the equilibrium interest rate. Firms borrow more for capital purposes. They buy more machines. These machines are productive. It allows them to produce more in the future. People want more things in the future. They take actions that cause a price to change that induces firms to take actions that will produce more stuff in the future. That's how the interest rate coordinates intertemporal production and consumption decisions. That big phrase that I used at the beginning, that's what I meant by that. So that's a well-functioning market system adjustment. The problem is that something else can cause that interest rate to move. And if you think of your money and banking classes, an increase in the money supply can also cause interest rates to fall. So think of that process I just described. There's an increase in the money supply, the interest rate goes down. Firms take that as a signal that people want more stuff in the future and start purchasing capital goods and producing more stuff for the future. Then they realize that, in fact, their preferences haven't really changed. They're creating goods that they're going to have a hard time finding a market for. This induces them to cut back, and that's what causes the business cycle. So in the Austrian business cycle world, in Hayek's model, money is basically a loose joint. It's something that can get in the way. Money is obviously very important in an economy. We learned even, back in Adam Smith's writings in The Wealth of Nations, that it's a unit of account. It helps facilitate trade, and it can be a store of value. But it can also cause a market system to get out of whack. Hayek's vision of what needed to be done was to try to keep money neutral. Unfortunately, and these are the ideas that he was expounding in Prices and Production, unfortunately, we don't have a good operational definition of the natural rate of interest. The way he expressed it was, you don't want the market rate of interest, which we can observe, to get out of line with the natural rate of interest that would equate savings and the demand for loanable funds. So it was not the sort of thing that gives good understanding of what can go wrong with a market economy that has money in it, money using, capital using economy, monetary economy, capital using money, monetary economy. What can go wrong with it? But he doesn't really have a good prescription except don't get there in the first place. Once you're there, you have to kind of let the system return to long run equilibrium. Keynes had very clear prescriptions that came out in his book, The General Theory. So both of them were working on these ideas during the 1930s, but Keynes's book was the one that kind of won the day. In brief, his vision was savers and investors are very different groups of people. Savings and investment can get out of whack, and you could end up getting an equilibrium in the economy that is a below full employment equilibrium, that you can get the economy stuck in a rut, as he put it in the 1920s. So his theory was a way to show how to get out of that by using fiscal policy, increases in government spending to try to get out of the problem of an economy facing high levels of unemployment. Keynes's message, of course, was much more popularly received. If you're in the middle of the Great Depression, you don't want somebody saying, "Oh, you shouldn't have done what you did in the past. Now you just have to kind of wait." So it was the one that won the day, but the Hayekian message is one that still resonates at certain points. I won't go into what I think of the two theories, but I can just say that they're both interesting approaches to the business cycle. Okay, a second area in which Hayek made contributions was his works on socialism and knowledge. Yeah, although he had this first encounter with Keynes in the 30s, much bigger fish to fry emerged very quickly. You're in the midst of the Great Depression in the 1930s, and a lot of people are saying, besides the debates between these economists, what is the way forward? How do we get out of this? How do we avoid ever being in this situation again? For many people, the Great Depression established in their minds that a free market system and capitalism, whatever you want to call it, just was not working. So it was a non-starter. We needed to find something else. And if you looked around at different parts of Europe, you saw lots of different systems on offer. In the Soviet Union, they had embraced full communism. In places like Spain and Italy, they had fascism. You had National Socialism emerging in Germany. Well, to a British intelligentsia, members of the British intelligentsia in the 1930s, they're saying, free market system doesn't seem to be working. We reject full-throated communism because of the impact that it's going to have on individual freedom. And we don't like authoritarian systems like fascism or National Socialism for the same reason. Why don't we try something that perhaps lies somewhere in between? And the idea was that, well, socialism is not full communism. It's not a market system. And indeed, let's call it democratic socialism, so that we get to keep democracy and socialism, have them together. And that's the sort of system that we want to promote. Well, if you were a member of the British intelligentsia in the 1930s, outside of a few people at the London School of Economics and a couple of other places, democratic socialism was the way ahead. Socialism was the idea that everyone was embracing. Now, as it turned out, Hayek had talked about and investigated, along with other Austrian economists, the ideas about socialism directly after World War I, because it was being promoted by Otto Neurath and a number of other people in the German language speaking countries. And articles had been written talking about the problems that exist with socialism. So Hayek's response was to publish, you can see it there, Collectivist Economic Planning. This is a book that he edited that contained translations of 3 or 4 different articles that were critical of socialism. One of them being an article by Ludwig von Mises, his mentor, that is preeminent article criticizing socialism. So he translated that into English, and he also provided a preface and a concluding essay to talk about these ideas more generally. So he wants to offer a criticism of socialism. Let's see if we can follow through what he had to say. first thing to do is to define socialism. And the standard definition at that time is nationalization of the means of production, state ownership of the means of production, no private firms. The state owns all of the firms that create goods. Okay, I know that socialism is being hotly debated these days in certain quarters. Whenever you have a discussion of this, you should try to figure out what the person means when they say socialism. Usually, today they don't mean full nationalization of the means of production, but that is the usual definition. Certainly was the definition that was being promoted in England at the time. So Mises's argument that was in the article that Hayek had translated said pretty straightforwardly. He said, well, okay, if there's no private ownership of the means of production, there's no prices that are attached to factors of production, the things that are used in the production of goods and services. If you don't have prices attached to factors of production, you don't have any understanding of their relative scarcity. And every important decision that's made in a firm when you're trying to figure out what to produce and how to produce it, you look at the various possible inputs, the prices that are attached to them, and then you make your decisions and you try to have total revenue exceed total cost and make a profit. Without private ownership of these resources and prices attached to them that express relative scarcities, firms are not going to be able to make rational decisions. So his point was, well, it's not going to work if you don't have these prices. We take these relative prices because we live in a market system for granted. But just imagine if you had to make decisions about what to produce. You don't know what things are scarce, what things are very expensive, valuable. Other things are very plentiful. How do you come to any kind of rational allocation of resources when you don't have that information? This was the challenge that Mises gave, and it was a strong one. So Hayek, in reproducing that article, felt like he had done a good job, but there were other arguments that were being made in the 1930s that were leaning on some of these developments in economic theory. So again, for people who have had a microeconomics course, perfect competition seems to work extremely well, and general equilibrium theory is a technique that was being developed in the 1930s, saying that you can model an economy by offering a set of equations, okay? A system of equations. And this system of equations could represent a free market system. It can represent a socialist system. The only difference between the two is that in a market system, entrepreneurs are making decisions about allocations of resources. And in a socialist system, it's socialist managers who are doing that. Oscar Longa, who dubbed himself a market socialist, said, what we can do is we can reproduce the efficiency characteristics of a perfectly competitive economic system by simply telling these socialist managers to take steps that would reproduce what would take place under competition. So we'll tell them to price at marginal cost individual firms, and would tell industries, the managers of industries, to make sure that all firms were producing at the minimum point on their long-run average cost curve. So we can just instruct people to take actions that would reproduce the good benefits, the efficiency benefits of a market system, but not have any of the social maladies that they claim would accompany it. Okay, so Hayek, in confronting this argument, gives a talk that later became his paper, Economics and Knowledge, that said, well, wait a second, what sorts of assumptions are we making about what information these socialist planners or anybody in a market have? And he said, even in the models of a competitive economic system, we're assuming basically that everyone has full information and that information is correct. Okay? And if you think about your models in your intermediate micro class, that often is the assumption that is being made. And he said, well, if we look at the real world, first of all, people have access to little bits of information, okay, little pieces of it that affect them, and some of the stuff that they think could be wrong. So how is it possible that we ever see any kind of coordination? If the world actually looked the way it looks in the models, we'd think, well, okay, it's easy because everybody has full information and all the information is correct. We can just move our way to equilibrium. But if people only have bits of knowledge, how does coordination ever take place? That was the question he asked in 1937. In his most famous article, The Use of Knowledge in Society, he basically answers the question. And he says that a well-functioning price system will allow that kind of coordination to occur. He says in a well-functioning price system, we don't have everybody has full knowledge. What you do have, though, are individuals who have knowledge of particular time and place, okay? Local knowledge. So I'm a producer of something. I have knowledge of input prices. That's what I'm most concerned with. I don't care about the prices of all these other things, but I know my own market. Similarly, as a consumer, everybody knows their own tastes and preferences, and they try to figure out how to satisfy those with the least cost way. Like I said, so each person has individual knowledge, and they interact in markets. They take the prices that exist in a market as datum, as givens, and then they make their decisions. But where do those prices come from? And this is the real key. He says, well, those prices are the reflections of the decisions of millions and millions and millions of people in their roles of producer or consumer interacting in markets. And if there's an increase in demand in one place, excuse me, that gets transmitted to the market through these market prices. The rise and fall of market prices are constantly taking place in response to the actions of these millions of people working on their local knowledge. In a sense, it's a giant communication system that allows that coordination to occur. So that was his answer, and it was a very powerful, it was a critique of socialism, but it's also a very powerful understanding of how allowing individuals to act on their own information through a system that allows that information to be transmitted is a great coordinating mechanism for the production of stuff, okay, simply put. And many of the interventions that people propose in markets muck that up, okay? Many of the interventions that you see discussed in your intro micro classes that are interfering with markets, price controls of various sorts, are things that keep those prices from being freely adjusting and reflecting the knowledge behind them. So that was a great contribution that Hayek made. I'll now move to a third area, the more movement away from economics that took place during World War II. And I think I can deal with this fairly quickly because what was important in this particular episode, he started this grand project, but what came out of it was that road to serfdom. And the road to serfdom ended up being, as I said, a very important volume that got attention in lots of different countries. And the argument there is there was a lot of enthusiasm in Britain in particular for the idea that we should continue socialism after the war. Essentially, a war economy is a socialized economy. A lot of decisions are made from the center about the production of war materials. And people said, well, look, if it's working well during the war, why don't we just continue it afterwards? And his argument was on the one hand to say, look, if you've got one particular goal in mind, that is defeating the Nazis, and that really concentrates how you're going to use your resources because everything is directed towards the war effort. But if you've got a regular economy in peacetime where you've got millions of people wanting different stuff, deciding how and what to produce becomes a very problematical point. Because if you have more of this stuff that some people want, you have less of this stuff that other people want. So how do those decisions get made? Well, under socialism with nationalization of the means of production and central planning, it's all made from the center. And yeah, people really are going to be getting upset about these decisions. And he worried too that when you're trying to make all these decisions from the center, most regular people are not going to want to be in a position of having to decide who gets what. And the danger then arises that bad people can get into control. And particularly when you have a system where all of the power is centralized, if a bad person gets into control, very bad things can happen. he was writing this during World War II. He could point to the example of Germany during World War II. He also was including the Soviet Union and early versions of the book, but then they became our allies. So he had to scratch out all the bits that was talking about the Soviet Union, but the same sort of principle would act there. Okay, I'll finally just say a few words about the Constitution of Liberty because I see I'm getting close to being out of time. So, World War II is over. He gets some fame from the Road to Serfdom. He forms the Mont Pelerin Society, and then he moves to the University of Chicago. So he's in the United States for the 1950s until 1962. And because of the Cold War, enthusiasm for socialist economic planning of the sort he criticized in The Road to Serfdom had waned considerably in the West. People did not want to have full nationalization of the means of production. But the welfare state became the new way of approaching economic problems. The idea that you should have, and this is what most people today, when they're talking about democratic socialism, they're really talking about a much more extended state involvement in economic decision-making, not owning the means of production, but dictating a lot of decisions that have to do with individual decisions that typically be in a full free market system would be left to individuals. So he wanted to critique the welfare state, and part of what the Constitution of Liberty does is to argue against it, but he also defended his own particular vision of what a good liberal society should be. And the Constitution of Liberty, I'd say, is the major book that really accomplishes this. So I'm going to give you just some quick phrases of his ideal system, and it is an ideal system. I mean, we try to work towards it, but it's something that has never fully existed. But it's a market society and a democratic polity under the rule of law. Rule of law means that laws are prospective, they're general, they're equally enforced, no one's above the law. You have political institutions that help balance powers. So you have the separation of powers in bicameral legislatures. These sorts of designs of institutions help to distribute power so no group within the society has too much power. And the idea of the rule of law and having general laws that are equally applicable are to avoid the two extremes that he found most pernicious. One is the granting of privilege to particular groups, and the other, which is the flip side of granting privilege to certain groups, it's discriminating against certain groups, okay? So if you've got this rule of law idea fully endorsed by the society, he thought that would provide the best hopes for avoiding those kinds of outcomes of privilege and discrimination. I'm getting towards the end here, so I'm not going to say too much about spontaneous orders and evolution, but I think if you think about what I said about use of knowledge in society, how a well-functioning market system would work, it works by allowing individuals to make their own decisions, and this is a great creative. Yeah, he talked about the creative power of a free civilization in the Constitution of Liberty. He says that institutions emerge through this attempt of people trying to accomplish their own ends, and often this gives rise to institutions that allow them to accomplish their own ends. These are what he dubbed spontaneous orders. He talked about institutions that emerge as a result of purposeful human action, but not of human design. Nobody plans on feeding Paris, but millions and millions of people making decisions in their jobs and in their homes every day give rise to the people who are going to demand food in Paris and all of the millions of people who are contributing to the production of food that feeds Paris every day. No one's intending it, but each person allowed to follow their own guidance, as it were, is contributing to it. So I thank you so much for your attention. I've talked rather quickly. I fear because I get excited about this stuff and I like talking about Hayek. But now I'll turn to some of the questions, and I'm just going to look at some of the questions that have come up in my chat. So I'm going to be looking over because it's on another screen. would Hayek consider modern social democracies such as Sweden as being on the road to serfdom? This is a fascinating question. So there was a period in time when Sweden, following actually ideas that had first been articulated or certainly embraced and endorsed by Gunnar Myrdal, going back to the 1930s, the development of a kind of Swedish welfare state. I certainly think that there was that kind of fear that could be articulated. But in more recent years, Sweden has gone in a very different direction. Indeed, one of the meetings of the Mont Pelerin Society that I attended in Sweden talked about high tax libertarianism, which sounds like a real contradiction in terms, but it basically was trying to say, well, you can have fairly high taxation, but if you're also enabling people to make their own decisions, school choice, for example, being one prominent one, you could actually have a freer society, even though it has a high tax base. So I think I would argue that England, in fact, would be closer to those dangers than Sweden would be currently. But that's an excellent question. Excellent question. Okay, so I'm going to look at another one. One of them said that normally the mention of Hayek or the Austrians typically produce shutdown in most economics departments and business schools. So I hope that that wasn't the case for this group. But then, you know, perhaps if it's tape recorded, you can show it to somebody and say, "What do you think?" It's known what Hayek's thoughts were on the works of Friedman and the neoclassical school of economics later in the 20th century. Yeah, this is a fascinating topic. So if we think of the two most prominent people known in America as being representative of classical liberalism, I think it would be Milton Friedman and Friedrich Hayek. So on all of the kinds of principles that have to do with the defense of a liberal order, they were in full agreement. But they really differed on their approach to economics. If you think of Hayek's words in criticizing the general equilibrium theory that was being used by socialists in the 1930s, what he was criticizing was the kind of theory that was then emerging that would end up being in the textbooks of economics departments today, and that I learned from when I was a student, particularly the notion of perfect competition. And Hayek has a wonderful piece called The Meaning of Competition, published in 1946, where he said, we don't want to be misled by these models. These models, in a sense, are showing us outcomes, but they're not really telling us how it occurs in the real world. And in his vision of how a market system works, it's rivalry. It's a competitive order. It's not a movement to equilibrium. It's a world of constant change where there's the higgling and haggling of marketplace activity. And so he actually, and the Austrians in general, look back to the writers who wrote before the formalization of economics started to take place in the 20th century, that understood how a market system actually works. And I have to say, you know, I studied economics as an undergraduate, and I did my PhD in economics. I feel like I really didn't start to understand economics until two things happened. One is I taught Econ 101, and I had to make it understandable to people who were not trained to think like an economist. And secondly, it was to study the Austrians, because it gave me a sense of what those models are representing outcomes, but they're not showing you how you get to those outcomes. And I think an understanding of economics that comes through studying the Austrians was quite helpful for that. Okay, I don't see any other questions in the chat. So I will be happy if anyone has any other questions going through time. to put to me, just send them to me by email, bruce.caldwell@duke.edu. I'd be very happy to try to respond to them.
There is
Oh.
one question, Dr. Caldwell. I know we are almost out of time.
Okay.
It says economists often write about or attempt to explain the time they are living in. Can you imagine or can you speculate what Hayek would write about the time we are living in?
Oh, I didn't see that there were these more further questions. Let me just say. How would he respond to the time that we're living in? Is that the question?
Yeah.
Okay. So he would not be sanguine. Certainly, I would say that he was no big fan of regulation. So if we think of the federal level, some of the steps that have been taken, he was no big fan of regulation, over-regulation. So he would have been happy with some of the decreases in regulatory capacity of the state. On the other hand, the rule of law was extremely important to him. So I think he would be concerned that some of the actions that are being taken have not been in accordance with the rule of law. And he was, as Milton Friedman was, and all Austrians are, a big proponent of free trade and free discourse, the free movement of ideas, of capital, of goods, and of people across borders. Not an open border idea, but certainly the idea that you try to that you gain through the intercourse with others. So I think on net he would be a bit worried about some of the developments that are taking place, at least in the United States currently.
Thank you so much, Dr. Caldwell. There are a few other questions, and I would certainly have them send them to you. Hopefully, if your time permits, you can respond. This has been a very, very, just fascinating journey that you have laid out in the life of Hayek, and we are grateful that you've taken the time. We are honored that you joined us today to present to, as you can tell, a very significant audience and significant interest in this topic, and it certainly is fascinating. And I can tell the questions could keep coming, and we can go on for hours, but we are right at that time. So thank you very much, Dr. Caldwell. And all of you virtually, if you'd give a round of applause for Dr. Caldwell, and please send him his questions if you have.
It was my great pleasure to be with you, and I hope at some point we have the opportunity to see each other again in the flesh, as they say. So it was my pleasure, and thank you for inviting me.